Okay, and I'd just like to welcome everyone to a discussion about particular questions that are sort of arising in the arts sector in Northern Ireland amongst artists and arts organisations. And I'll just ask everyone to introduce themselves. So Francesca first.
Hi, I'm Francesca Biondi from Gallery 545, and Gallery 545 is an online gallery with exhibitions of physical venues specializing in contemporary art on Northern Ireland. The idea behind the gallery was to support and promote artists based here in the region, because I think there's a wealth of talent. And Gordon, you invited me to have a discussion about the lack of space, the lack of infrastructure, and Dana commercial galleries, I think, are very much part of the infrastructure, and as well as studio spaces and other platforms to promote and support the artists. But sure, we will get back to this in our discussion later.
Jane?
Hi, I'm Jane Morrow. I am the Strategic Vision and Development Curator at PS Squared. I am also an independent curator with my own projects. I'm a writer. I'm a general kind of gun for hire. And I have been until recently a PhD researcher. And my area of focus has been around the precarity of artist studios in Belfast.
Conor?
Hi, I'm Conor Shields. I'm CEO of Community Arts Partnership. Most recently, I suppose, in terms of looking at something more generalized across the whole sector, I've been not only on the COVID recovery task force, but I've been on the strategic task force through Department for Communities, which tried to look at an integrated way that the arts could be supported across all government departments. So that report has apparently gone in. And more generally, I'm not a visual artist. I'm a musician and writer and poet. Thankfully not by trade, but more by inclination. And I'm very happy to be part of this conversation today.
And Joy?
Hi everyone, my name is Joy Gerrard. I'm a visual artist and I'm representing Queen Street Studios. I've been a member here for about 5.5 years and sat on the artist board for just a little bit less time than that. So we are based in East Belfast. We have 50 artists across 48 studios, and we also have 2 gallery spaces. And this year is our 40th birthday. So we've been around for a while.
Yeah. And Gail?
Hi, I'm Gail Prentice. I'm director here at Flax Art Studios. So Flax Art Studios was set up in 1989 to provide studios for artists here in Belfast. We have presently 2 buildings. One in Bedford Street and one in North Street. Our North Street location is primarily for emerging artists, and we support around 40 emerging artists in that space, and also use that space as our digital fabrication lab, which is open to our artists and creatives and the public to use. We also have the smallest gallery in Belfast there, Threshold, which utilizes a window box space as a more experimental pilot space for our artists to use and other artists as well. Our Bedford Street building, we house around 40 artists. We also have an international residency space. We have our wood workshop, kiln, and what else do we have? A spray booth in this area, which is open for artists again and for public use. And we house workshops in that space also. What else can I say about Flax? We're working on a feasibility study and business case for sustainable studio provision for Belfast and the sector. Which I'll probably talk about a bit more during this discussion. And I also sit on the Belfast Visual Arts Forum steering group to work on visual arts sectoral issues, specifically artist studios. Thank you for inviting me today. I'm looking forward to talking to you all.
Okay, well, the first sort of question that arose when I spoke to Francesca, this was quite some time ago, and it came up again in the assembly, the conference that was held at Queen Street Studios a week or so ago, was the question of space, the question of access to space, usable spaces, workable spaces for artists and for arts organizations. So I'll just open the floor to anyone who wants to talk about that particular issue.
Jane, maybe you would like to.
Yeah, I was just going to say
about the problematic.
Yeah. So there are
spaces, in Belfast.
There are 3 of us on the call who either are part of organizations or represent organizations that offer space. And I think, you know, when I first returned to Northern Ireland, the topic of my PhD came from not really knowing my way around Belfast. I'm not from Belfast. And I had been doing some work with Visual Artists Ireland, and I had a list of spaces, and 3 of the spaces on the list weren't there when I went to find them. And I realized that actually these organizations were kind of being forced to be quite peripatetic. Not by choice, but by a combination of factors that affect a lot of post-industrial cities. But I think there are some kind of Belfast specific circumstances here at play as well. But on the other hand, you know, between Flax, QSS, PS Squared, there's what, 100 spaces? It represent, you know, 100 studio spaces more. Yeah.
150 if Gail is 80 and we're 50.
Oh yeah.
It's more. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, we hear quite often from others who visit the city to say, oh my God, there's so many spaces here. What are you all complaining about? And the thing is, it does seem almost like an embarrassment of riches, but there is serious instability within the sector as well in this particular area of the infrastructure.
I think it's an interesting model that we have here in Belfast. I think the studio spaces are grassroots organizations that came out because artists, curators, and managers that got together. And then it was back even in 2009. I was one of the founding members of Belfast Platform for the Arts. And then there are so many empty buildings in the city, that's right, and now even outside the city centre. And then developers need someone to take those spaces because they don't have to pay rates. So we've been able, all of us, just to strike some deals with the landlords, but those deals don't last. That's the problem of the precarity here of the infrastructure, that after 2 or 3 years, and then you have to leave, sometimes at very short notice, and that creates considerable disruption and for the work of the artist. And because studio spaces are not just a place where you work, it's a place where you meet, where you invite curators, commercial galleries, non-commercial galleries, clients, whatever the clients are, and also where you support each other. And then you also have peer critique in the space. It's that complex, and organizations are not just rooms.
Yeah, I think that's what inspires.
I was going to just agree with Jane. You know, on a kind of day-to-day ongoing basis, we don't have a problem with space. You know, you're absolutely right, there is lots of vacant buildings. You know, there is this particular rate reduction for landlords to rent to charities, which it puts us in quite a good position. So, and you know, I had a group that came from Dublin to do studio visits last week, and they were just in awe of these wonderful studios that we have. So kind of, you know, your first impression is we have great spaces here and we have amazing grassroots organizations, but the problem is precarity, permanence and funding, like very basically our incredibly low level of funding that we have in comparison to the equivalent organizations in Dublin. So, you know, a lot falls on administrators and boards who are doing an incredible amount of voluntary work for free. And, you know, to speak in a bigger sense, it is just kind of like trickle down from Stormont that there isn't enough funding. So therefore we can't put in the infrastructure that we need. So it's not a space problem, it's a kind of money infrastructure problem. So.
Can I also just say that studios, as part of the infrastructure here, have kind of, they fell off the radar for quite a long time. And I mean that from a funder's perspective, you know, say, for example, a new round of local authority grants that came in that set a threshold for income generation. You know, we're not spaces that necessarily generate much income. We certainly don't generate much footfall. And we can't kind of be measured by those traditional matrices that are applied across the cultural sector. You know, obviously we can apply for funding in order to provide subsidized studios, with the rent for which then goes back into the organizations. But I think the lack of funding for organizations, but also the lack of funding for artists is quite important here, because these things are interlinked. And I think to see space as a positive, actually, which it is, it actually kind of undermines that Venn diagram of, you know, artist labor, what is paid for, are artists being paid, is production being paid for rather than engagement, you know, the buildings themselves, and then the impacts for practice as well, because we see quite often, and to some extent this might be a Belfast specific thing or a Northern Ireland specific thing, where there's an element of bombast needed. You know, there's a look at what we can do, here's a huge spectacle. But one of my arguments throughout my thesis has been, you know, that we can't have all those end products, all those things that do attract people to Northern Ireland, unless we actually put in the infrastructure at those layers that mean that artists want to come here and produce their work here and have space to do so and are connected to other artists and so on. And so for me, that's why this is a particularly crucial part of that ecosystem. I mean, I completely agree with Francesca as well that, you know, an art market is something that there's huge potential for here, but it's kind of trying to get everything up to an even enough keel that we can even really run with anything else. You know, everything is kind of dependent on everything else within that structure.
Yes, I think, you know, priorities just give artists the opportunity to work, and then what they create, sure, then it becomes visible in the public domain. And then I had a conversation also with Belfast City Council and then the cultural unit, which I have to say they've been very supportive in their conversations and in our dialogues to studio spaces. And I think having creative people and being able to develop some amazing initiatives and bring them to the public domain, and that will tie in with the strategy of having a more vibrant city and more vibrant spaces even in the city center, and then ultimately make those spaces pleasant spaces to visit, to work, to live. And so that's why it's important, I think, to invest in infrastructure that allows artists to work. But yeah, so I'm not too sure if you'd like to, at this stage, maybe suggest some possible solutions to this. I had, for example, a conversation with the culture unit at Belfast City Council, and I suggested that in order to give artists permanent studio spaces, some publicly owned buildings could be used. And there are buildings which belong to Belfast City Council, so the Department of Communities, other departments. And then Royal Avenue, for example, has been transformed in a cultural venue, but there's still many floors upstairs, up above what was the Tesco supermarket, or the main hall. They're still empty, so those could be used. But also there are some other interesting spaces, like the Belfast Telegraph building is vacant at the moment, and also there's the Wilmot House in Lady Dixon's Park, and also the Riddle Warehouse, for example, which is currently being redeveloped. So that could be a solution. But in my conversation with the Belfast City Council, I also, and actually what's my conversation with the cultural unit, but there was a large scale consultation carried out by Belfast City Council back in April with the Turley consultants, where they pointed out the lack of studio spaces. But I also suggested that we need also creative hubs, just bringing together not only studio spaces, but also galleries, commercial and non-commercial, where artists could have more visibility. And it's not just visibility, support, and also visibility support, but also give them maybe possible space where they can sell their works as well. I'm talking, my gallery is a commercial gallery, and I know commercial galleries selling artworks by living artists that don't make a huge amount of money, really, because the market is quite difficult. And so I think it's important, and the overheads are quite high, so it's important to have affordable spaces for commercial galleries as well. And there was also I remember Kira Hickey, and in our conversation and in our brought at the IN assembly, pointed out the fact that there are potential art buyers here in Northern Ireland, but they don't have the confidence to buy. So it's also just trying to create an art market here for Northern Ireland, and then working not only with individuals, but also with public collections, for example, and have more interest, have them to have more interest in what the artists are doing here. And public collections I think it's an important element of this infrastructure as well. And I know the Arts Council is buying art by living artists, but then they just disappear behind doors. For example, some of the artworks are visible on the UK Art website, and some others are not. And
sorry, Francesca, you spoke for quite a while there. Conor had his hand up there. We're moving into a kind of infrastructure discussion, which will come in a minute, I think. So Conor.
Yeah, various things have already been outlined, but precarity, funding, and ecosystem have been spoken about. Precarity, of course, affects our whole community. It affects every publicly supported service, and indeed those private organizations dependent upon that. Ecosystem is talked about so much, the definition of which I'm not sure, because it tends to be one thing or another. I'm not a big fan of the term, because I actually think that what we have are hothouses for certain sections of our particularly our arts, and we have others that are outside that greenhouse, that are left to shrivel and die or fend for themselves in whatever prevailing weather conditions there are. And then, of course, the cursed funding issue. Now, our funding issue comes from the fact that we are in a downward spiral of block grant funding from the UK to Northern Ireland in any case. And we do not have the local mechanisms to deal with supportive funding, because we have no political representation at the minute locally. And in the last 25 years, we've had 10 years where we have not had access to Stormont, where we have not had an assembly in operation. So this is nothing new. People have talked about in comparison to the Republic. There is no comparison in terms of public funding per capita. We lag significantly behind. And so the fix of this is not a simple one. This is not about tweaking policy. This is not about necessarily having conversations. We actually, I think, need to start to recognize that for every gain that some section of this so-called ecosystem makes, it is at the expense of some other section of this ecosystem. And for those whose faces perhaps don't fit, or whose models of working, as Jane alluded to, that we don't have matrices to measure all types of work that is going on. And so we still work within this neoliberalist structure where if you can't count it, it doesn't count. But of course, we know that most things that really count can't be counted, and we have to somehow support that too. What I would say is that this is not, like Dublin went through this for years until they recognized that cultural output and indeed cultural support locally needed to be completely reviewed, and it needed to be redeveloped from the ground up. They went through an exhaustive process about 2011, 2 years of studies before that went back into Shannon, and then actually came out with an integrated plan from which we see higher levels of investment, more segmented, more strategized levels of investment, so that there were areas that would be kind of hived off to support more international work, areas that were more appropriate to grassroots working, changing the character of national portfolio organizations, changing short-term funding into multi-year funding, all these. And these are structural. And if you want to call them, these are the soft infrastructural elements that make up this so-called ecology. So this is not, there are no quick fixes in this. And when you add in, especially around artist spaces, these meanwhile spaces that artists often find themselves in, all arts organizations, if they don't own the deeds to the space that they're in, are all in the exact same precarious position. Every 5 years, every 3 years, whatever your lease is, once you get to the end of that term, boom, you've got a month to get out. If the landlord says, I've got an opportunity that I want us to grab, out you go, whether you've got somewhere to go to or not. There are no monies to support moving to another premises. These are just commercial expenses that have to be incurred. So like there are systematic difficulties, and these obstacles are constant right across the sector. The sector also relies on our artists, whether they're visual artists working in spaces, whether they're literary artists, musicians, whatever it might be. And the reliance on them is 100%. Our arts administrators are not going to do this work, much as they'd like to. I would hate to think what sort of work I could support in terms of the visual arts, but that's another story. So this is a whole issue or range of issues that need to be explored in a purposeful way over a longer term. Plus, when you add in the very difficult peculiarities of Belfast at this time, if we speak specifically about that, where 12 acres of Belfast city centre, our most historic quarter, the birthplace of the city, through NAMA, through a discounted scheme, after the global financial crisis wallop, it has impacted massively on the environment of Belfast. And that has sent ripples right through what is available and what isn't, what is short-term, what can be accessed. And also, we also have these lack of joined upness around the approaches. Francesca alluded to essentially community asset transfer, that buildings are owned or could be owned by the public purse or by the city purse, or are indeed owned by them and could be put to other uses. And we have scheme after scheme that talks about this, but the actuality of it in a systematic, strategized way isn't present. So this is about space, and it is also about the governance infrastructure that we have to work within. And then you take what I think Joy said was trickle down. I think it's probably less naturalistic than just how water flows. This is actually about how one dams flows of monies towards certain areas in order to support particular strategic views of a very small number within a council, for example. So council now have set themselves very grandiose, very expensive, and very external looking plans to invite more visitors, to attract more, and to talk more about turnover. In terms of actually how that relates to the grassroots, I don't know. I think there is a massive disconnect there. And that bringing us into the conversation at this point, perhaps, could be seen as a rather cynical exercise rather than incorporating all these conversations at a much earlier point. Now, I know all of us have been part of the Belfast conversation that led to the Belfast agenda, that led to all the various ways that we've heard Belfast reassert its cultural sense. But has it actually managed to do the very necessary thing for the artist in the city? And one final thing I would throw into at this minute, there are organizations who have done amazing things out of the opportunity in Meanwhile Space. Now, sometimes those have a distorting effect on whatever the marketplace might be to access art spaces. If an artist comes to me and says they want to rent a space, I give them you can have this space for a week and it'll cost you X. There is no way that I can compete in terms of price point with some of these organizations that have managed to acquire huge spaces where they're costing, maybe £60 a month. So we have a new distortion in this as well because of market forces through developers and the spaces that they have acquired. So it's a massive problem. And I think it needs problematized before we can actually find a way to come up with what will have to be very complex solutions. And it's not all about more money. It's about more joined upness. It is about being more strategic with what we have. And of course, we need to advocate for more support generally. So I'll park that there because that's it. Where do you begin? It's huge.
It does sound to me like we're sort of drifting into the infrastructure strategy. How do we go about proposals to shift the situation? But Gail, did you want to say anything? Because I'm not. I just can't remember you speaking at this particular section. So I don't want to put you on the spot. Is there anything you want to add to that part before we move into the kind of infrastructure section?
I think Conor has basically put it all in a nutshell. Very much so there. It was a very basic thing for me when I joined Flax. The immediate thing 12 years ago, the immediate thing I noticed was, well, we need security of tenure here before anything else. Before I can actually plan for this organization and develop this organization, we need security of tenure. We need fit for purpose studios. We need not to have waterfalls coming into studio spaces. We need to be in safe spaces. We need not to be in buildings where we're in danger of not being able to escape from it should it go on fire. We need very basic requirements. And that's what inspired me to approach City Council 12 years ago and say, listen, Flax has been in existence here since 1989. If we had had a mortgage, we would have had it paid off by now. So, you know, what is the use of the public money of going in? And, you know, we could keep, we're in a circular place here. We've done a feasibility. Feasibilities about artist studios have been done since the 90s. We're not the first. So Conor, I'm just hoping, you know, that I see this out before my retirement, basically, because this has been round and round for many, many years. And I will keep dedicating the time to that cause. But it just, you know, you're right. I think, you know, on the ground, are we really feeling development here? Are we really feeling support? Are we really getting to the point of our actual need? Because we have many conversations, but, you know, I've met with many people, education authorities, you know, you name it, asset transfer, community finance, and, you know, I've met right across the board, and it's all very useful, and everybody has really great things to say. But when are we actually getting to solving this issue? No studio in this city has any security of tenure. We're sitting in Bedford Street here. It took us a year to set everything up, get our workshop in place, get the artists all comfortable. We have a year and a half left. There's going to be a hotel here. Absolutely, this is prime location. PSS were based here before us. So this is the way it goes. Our North Street space, we have 9 months. We have good deals with the landlords for the very purpose of that we are a charity. We can get rates, give them rates relief. But the money that we put away into our reserves, you can guarantee that'll diminish the next time we move in a year and a half. So, you know, really we're firefighting. It's very difficult to build an organization and plan, make a 5-year plan when you're really just looking at the next year ahead. And it would be great to have multi-annual support, but fundamentally what we need is security of tenure. We need that investment. We need a bit of investment from that, and when we can lever the rest of what we need going forward. You know, it's been done before. We looked at best practice, we looked at WASP Studios in Glasgow. They started the same year as Flax Art Studios. They now have over 100 studios, Jane, keep me right, across the UK and Scotland. So it's, you know, it can be done. So let's just do it. Let's get there.
I've been keeping people to around a sort of 4 minutes. I'll say something once you reach 5. So everyone's been around that. They've been quite disciplined at some level.
I'm quite happy for everybody to come in and let's all talk about it. Well,
Jane's got her hand up. Does there anyone want to say anything else about space before we move into infrastructure? I know they're related, but Jane, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say, you know, Gail has been such a powerful advocate for this work for such a long time. And I think again, it comes back to like almost a question of value and how you measure certain things, because we've been saying this. Sometimes the things that have worked are numbers. And you know, Gail and I were involved with the Studio Forum when we put a group of numbers together and we read them back to Belfast City Council and said, this is the dire circumstances. So just to give you a sense of those, in the first instance in 2019, of artist studios in Belfast, 17 of 17 organisations had tenancy agreements of fewer than 3 years. 16 of those 17 had fewer than 18 months, 15 fewer than 12 months, 7 fewer than 9 months, and many more, including the organisation that I work for, on month-to-month rolling contracts, including tenancy at will agreements. Now, we as PS Squared were in the footprint of the proposed Tribeca skyscraper. Anecdotally, we have heard that Tribeca certainly won't be going anywhere fast. However, we also do know, particularly QSS and PS squared, that our development body, if they perceive a lack of security around premises, can and will use that to defund an organisation. Belfast City Council has been very responsive, and that earlier when I mentioned that, you know, studio organisations didn't kind of meet the thresholds that had been set, they listened. They listened to the numbers that we gave them, and then they set up this new fund. Now it's very small and it's very short term. So again, like studios themselves, small, short term. But yeah, we do know that it feels like we're getting somewhere some of the time. But Gail, as soon as you apply that kind of longitudinal perspective on it, it feels like we're going around in circles constantly.
Yeah, it does. It does, you know, and I know talking to Turley's recently, you know, this, you know, I was kind of involved with sort of getting that off the ground as well, because we had obviously just completed the refresh of our feasibility study as Stormont collapsed once again. We refreshed it twice due to Stormont collapsing. So Turley's again are looking at studio provision, and I know they're trying to put harder economic measurement onto that, but you know, it is kind of, and just, you know, they say it will inform policy, but that could be in 5 years' time, before we get an outcome from that. So, like, it is quite circular, and I think there's enough paper evidence there that demonstrates the need, the absolute need, for artist studio provision.
The only thing that I would say on the Turley piece, and obviously the work isn't finished yet or anything, but just from conversations that I've had so far, you know, firstly, that piece of work's really delayed, unfortunately, which means that it didn't actually serve the studios who all had tenancy agreements that ran out in March. Secondly, I think maybe just because Turley sat slightly outside the sector a wee bit, they're maybe seeing some of these things in isolation. So, for example, one of the conversations I had was, you know, they proposed that every studio in the city raise their rents by 300%, and that we all did it. But I said, look, there are 2 spaces up the stairs from where I am now. They're tiny wee spaces, but they're £40 a month. And those artists are in arrears, because we also have to look at the level, the percentage of artists here, almost a third, who are living on or below the poverty line. You know, this is what I mean about, like, even when I say ecosystem, you know, I'm not even just talking about necessarily disciplines or anything, but it's this entire a holistic kind of understanding, I think, is what I mean. That's all. Thank you.
Sorry, just Francesca, I saw you had Joy. Francesca, Joy, and then I'll just say, let's move into infrastructure.
Joy, would you like to go ahead then? Yeah. Yes.
I mean, I think what I'm going to say is it's kind of space, infrastructure, individual, you know, organization. It's hopefully we're moving towards infrastructure. You know, I really appreciated your kind of history, Conor, of what had happened in the Republic, and, you know, the fact that they faced very similar problems, you know, post kind of Celtic Tiger, and then 2011, you've seen this kind of incredible uplift in, you know, in funding of the arts. I mean, it, like Jane, you know, I love figures, you know, and evidence in this kind of circumstance. So obviously, the South just released their funding, which was I think not as much as they'd hoped for, but, you know, on the back of an envelope kind of basis, the South has 4 times as much funding. I think you probably know exactly how much this is, Jane, but as far as I can see on a kind of pro rata basis, it's 4 times as much arts funding as we do, you know, on a pro rata kind of basis. And I know the Arts Council here are aware of that. You know, last year's 5% cut represented a more significant cut. And they know that, for example, Wales get twice as much funding pro rata as we do. So, you know, I use that word kind of like trickle down. I suppose I wasn't thinking trickle down so much as in money, so to speak. I was kind of thinking more in ideas of kind of trust. And I mean, I do think that we do need, and we're going to talk about that in terms of infrastructure, a kind of long-term solution. And that does seem to be more imagination and more vision and more leadership, which would happen hopefully if Stormont was actually there. I mean, that seems to be the big stumbling point. What I would love to see is, you know, in this kind of atmosphere and the reality of the lack of funding, I'd love to see both Belfast City Council and the Arts Council making their funding application process much simpler. In my mind, as an individual artist, and, you know, looking at what the organisation has to go through, this is an incredibly complicated process that takes individuals up to a month. And then, as far as I can see, both the Arts Council and Belfast City Council, they've made it so complicated for themselves that then takes up to 6 months for them to kind of go through this and tick all their boxes. Why not just, like, with the lack of funding, just make it simpler for everybody to apply for the small amount of money that there actually is? And that would be something that I would really like to lobby for, if I could.
Francesca, quickly, then Conor.
Yeah, just some comments about what has been said so far. And Conor, yes, as you pointed out, you know, measuring the needs and the benefits of the sector requires, like a study with complex solutions, and then those solutions can come in the short term. But I thought so. In our conversation has emerged how, you know, individual studio spaces, individual arts organizations are always trying to find the solutions for themselves. And going to one department, to the council, I think it's just that those Arts Council, Belfast City Council, Department of Communities, they should be working together really to find solutions for us, instead of just always us just trying to prove what we need and then trying to get a bit of funding here, a bit of funding there. I think there needs to be more coordination of the efforts needed here to support the whole art sector in Northern Ireland, between councils, the Arts Council, Department of Communities, other departments as well, because at the end of the day, you know, the budget the Arts Council, Department of Communities it depends on decisions that are being made at the higher level about the whole overall budget for Northern Ireland. But yes, there are some short-term solutions. Funding. I think the fund is not only the amount of funding we receive, but the nature of the funding. What do we need? We need more capital funding. And then funding for the artists. Yes, let's simplify and the funding applications. Let's make the funding really possible to access to those artists and other organizations as well. And that could be done probably in the short term, as well as I said, even, yes, that's all I'd like to say. Other elements of the infrastructure we didn't touch, all touched only briefly, just opportunities for international projects, opportunities to access funding, not just here in Northern Ireland, but outside Northern Ireland as well. So there's an element here for the British Council intervention, just in possible collaborations again between government organizations, a council organization, and then the likes of the British Council to other organizations outside Northern Ireland as well. Well, including the Republic of Ireland and then the UK. And then something really important that we need more voices to talk about arts and artists and what they're doing, and community arts partnership are doing an amazing job. always advocating for the sector and talking about the artist. And Gordon, yeah, I enjoy reading your interviews about the artists, but we need more voices, and then we need more voices to reach the general public, because at the end of the day, it's important to rely on public opinion to get our support, to make them our supporters so that they can influence policies here, I think.
Conor.
Yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it? And it is almost so well established a problem that it seems almost intractable. And also bear in mind that some of the solutions that were arrived at in the Republic didn't necessarily help all sectors as well, because we have, for want of a better word, we have a very hierarchical political system, to say the least. So even when we do have lots of grassroots study, where we've had lots of conversations documented. Now, Jane will know the study I'm talking about that was undertaken in the Republic. I remember it being something like 140 pages of output of the main study before you got to the appendices. And that was the most rigorous piece of work that's been done on the island in terms of looking at all these different layers, not just the kind of the public-facing infrastructure that we have to contend with, but actually what affects the lives of ordinary artists and those who benefit from just the everyday artist. And finally, the Republic has recognized that there is such a thing as an everyday artist who needs to eat, who needs to live, and they've piloted this living wage kind of system for the Republic. That has been proposed within both the COVID recovery and indeed the task force processes. And I got word just this week back from the department that they are now using what they're calling a report to inform how they move forward. But the work that we all do within the arts touches every aspect of government working. So there's loads of our artists are working to support health outcomes in healthcare settings and beyond. We're working with environmental issues, with historic buildings. We're constantly asked to come and perform these processes around this problematic, this structure, this potential. You look at all the work that's been done around mural work in Belfast, you look at animation and so on. It all depends on that we have a healthy, supported artist at the center of these conversations. And to my mind, we haven't. Now, as soon as perhaps you structure how those conversations are, invariably you get people who have to represent, and then they become part of, well, you're part of that group, so you would say that, or you're part of that organization, or you would say that. At the height of Arts Matter campaign, which I think was successful in embodying that voice, but in real terms, we had very little impact on the quantum of monies that were given to the sector. We turned around two maybe cuts, but the cuts were of a greater magnitude than the cut were on a lesser magnitude than the cut we've just received in terms of that 5% that you alluded to, Joy. So, I do think that, and I would love to see this conversation included in perhaps a rejuvenation of Arts Matter NI. We still have the structures there. We still have the website. We still have all the contacts. And I think this would be a good place for us to start to kick this ball about again, and perhaps be more precise in our targeting, and perhaps broader in the grassroots that we reflect. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And it's something that when you have a beleaguered arts infrastructure, where you have all your time is spent chasing money and firefighting, as Gail alluded to earlier, it's very difficult to find either the intellectual headspace or the feckin' time just to do this type of work. So, and you know, I've been asking for 20 years and more for our funders, our city council funders, our arts council, to harmonize their processes so that we aren't speaking a different language to them and requiring different outputs from them. I know you want outcomes presented in that way. Well, you're not looking for outcomes. You're looking for it actually to be that. No, like, this is madness. When we're actually all doing exactly the same work, we are creating art, whether it is the commission is from the general public, or it is something that has sprung from our own imaginations and our own creative genius. So how do we actually start to thread all this together? It's huge. And bear in mind as well that while this conversation has gone on in Ireland, this conversation has gone on in Belgium, and it's had various good effects and various bad effects. And of course, the contention around culture in a place like Belgium is massive as well, where you've got two main traditions and you've got this kind of buffering, and the arts actually help in this, in creating this more shared space. And we see the same in Holland, where some tremendous imaginations and strides have been made to support grassroots work, and indeed a platform for more international work. And of course, now that we've become a third nation in terms of accessing European funding, we have to wait on the funding circle to turn its light towards the UK. That's not going to happen for ages. Brexit has killed whatever favour there may have been. And so we're waiting on other organisations and other processes to support that. So I think we really do need to sit down very purposefully and start to actually dissect not only the problematic that we face in terms of the infrastructure that we're up against, but actually what we're up against as individuals. Like when I hear that an artist is working I forget what the statistic you said. Did you say a third or a half were in poverty?
It's just under a third, that live on or below the poverty line.
Well, I'm sure it's 90% that don't pay tax now that it's 12 grand a year. Do you know what I mean? Or maybe 80%. Like, this is fundamentally a difficulty that no matter what policies are coming down from government or what policy processes we're advocating, we need to change the circumstances of the artist at the center of the conversation. And beyond that, let's see if we can ripple out towards the impacts that the artists support within our community, right across our governmental superstructure. I think one of the most crucial things is that we also have very little power when it comes to accountability. So biting the hand that feeds is not a good place to be. It's not a good strategy to get support on ongoing. And for somebody like me that's gobby and tries to be in those conversations and tries to offer a very different sense of what the potential might be and what the difficulties are, it's risky. It is a risky activity to be at. So when we have an
5 minutes there, Conor.
When we have an opportunity, we need to recognize that, you know, it's really down to us, that it's, to borrow a phrase, it's ourselves alone that may have to do something about this, and that may have to force an issue. And I really do think that we're in a position, we've talked about it before, we've talked about just going grey, going black, saying, no, we can't work anymore, artists can't work anymore. Now, that might be good as a political standpoint for a moment, but obviously artists have to work. Their precarious livelihoods are bad enough already by not saying, oh, here's a good idea, don't earn anything for the next month and let's see what it's like. We really need to start shifting up the conversation for ourselves. And I would say that this conversation today, I think, might be a good starting point to reinvigorate the Arts Matter campaign around certain specifics of this precarity for the individual, specifics around the inadequacy of the cultural infrastructure to offer support in an infrastructural ecosystem that is constantly talked about, but the outcome, the outworking of it, we don't really feel.
We're sorry, Jane, you got your hand up there. I'll come back to you in a second. Look, we're past 50 minutes there, and I'm going to sort of wind it up because I think that's long enough, unless people want to go for another 10 or 15. I think we've sort of covered in various ways space, infrastructure, and kind of elements of the beginning of a discussion about solutions. Maybe if everyone just had one final moment to say whatever else is on your mind, and then we can close it up there. So maybe if we start with Francesca, Jane, Conor, Joy, and Gail. So Francesca.
Let's find more spaces and opportunities to work together, but instead of having conversations, let's make sure that those conversations lead to actions. And what do we do next? Where are we going to? Who are we going to? Who's going to help us to get what we want? Yeah. But yeah,
Jane,
Arts Matter campaign.
Jane?
I think in terms of kind of galvanizing as the arts sector as a whole, it will be important for us to see what comes out of the living and working conditions of artists report and research that Arts Council is soon to be undertaking. And the last one was 2010, 2011, can't quite remember. And we've obviously had significant change in that time. And I think once that becomes available, I know that the survey becomes available. I know that they have been recruiting for a steering group. But I think we all need to ensure that as many artists as we know we possibly can complete that survey, because the picture will be very informative.
Conor?
Yeah, believe it or not, I'm positive about change. I wouldn't be in this sector if I didn't think that we couldn't affect change in a positive manner. We have had wins. We have the ear of government. The more that we're doing this, the more that we're actually having those conversations, the more government starts to trust us and our judgment as well. I think galvanize is a good word, Jane. I think we need to re-galvanize ourselves as a sector in all its myriad parts. I don't look forward to what the outcome of that research will be, because I think it will be dire in terms of the where the artists find themselves now. It's dire for so many organizations in any case. The anticipation always every year is who will not survive. And if an organization goes down, it's not just an administrator or two. You know, the cascade is that all the artists that were being supported, all the communities that were being supported, that's lost as well. So we really need to, and I think we brought it in spades to the recent strategy work that was done by the task force. We told them in no uncertain terms how precarious things are. But again, they know how precarious their situation is, as well as they see a block grant and a Barnett formula that's designed to start to cut monies coming into the publicly funded sector in any case. So we have to be far cuter. Like, I've heard community asset transfer bandied about for years and years. We see Scotland having massive impact, not only for the arts, but for communities to actually have cultural hubs that Francesca alluded to have these spaces for community. And we see nothing of that here. We see no real impact. The only one that I think has any major success recently is, of course, the courthouse in Bangor, and fair play to Kieran and Alison and the work that they've been doing. I've done feasibilities, quite a few, for buildings that have such architectural significance in the city that they shouldn't be let go to rack and ruin. And I've made sure that we had artists completely framed within those plans, and in fact artists in residence, so we could bring artists from outside Belfast and outside the country who could come, live, work, engage, and go away with something. No, still not funded, still not even progressed beyond, well, that's a very nice, very expensive piece of work that, you know, X, Y, or Z, you know, the big accountancy firms get. They always win. We don't. These wins are very few and far between. And so I really do think we need to mobilize, not only personally, but I think we need to mobilize the ideas that we have and start to really generate ideas that find an obvious understanding within the public's imagination, but also are helpful for our government if they want to actually support the objectives that they've set themselves.
Joy?
Oh, just very briefly, I mean, yeah, what you say is totally correct, Conor. I mean, there is no lack of vision, organization, ambition, and hard work coming from, you know, the voluntary sector, coming from the studios. You have two people here from organizations that are 40 years old and 35, 36 scale, is it your one? Yeah. So, you know, if we had premanence from the beginning, we would be sitting in our studios and we would be able to take that energy that the precariousness sucks out of us and put it into, you know, making more opportunities. It's just like a no-brainer. So exactly what you say, Conor, about getting those very simple messages up to a higher level is incredibly important. And it's like a kind of carrot and stick, you know. All of our studios, you know, Flax, PS Squared, Queen Street Studios, all of us need permanence. And there is the opportunity to have a permanent space for all of us. It's not a competition, you know, and that can grow. So, but you need that vision first. So, you know, where does it come from? It just seems to be, you know, again, lobbying, you know, getting the message across. But it's certainly not from lack of trying and energy at all of our levels. So I guess this is what this conversation is about. And thanks, it's been very nice to listen to everybody.
Gail?
Yes, I agree, Joy and Conor, and with everyone has said. I think we have all put so much energy into this, and you know, we keep putting energy into it, and we want to put energy into it and continue to do that. And Conor, I agree, I'm all for the Arts Matters and rejuvenation. I would totally be there 100% on that. I think that's, you know, what we need to do. We need to keep campaigning, we need to keep lobbying. You know, this is the only thing that's going to, you know, make us heard and continue to be heard.